Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to do a discussion about the Penguin Book of Haiku, which I really enjoyed. I read it on and off for a period of a few months, trying to give each poem some space, some time to focus on it, appreciate what was happening with it. And so it took me a while because there's roughly 1,000 haiku in this volume, which is one reason I recommend it. But I learned a lot. I learned about all sorts of different, types of haiku, different forms, the classical sort of 5-syllable, 7-syllable, 5-syllable haiku, but different ways in which haiku could be linked, and poets could sort of collaborate and create a linked sequence of haiku verses, or could throw out a challenge and then have a response to it. The different subjects that haiku took on, I've sort of only had understood it as a work that focuses on sort of this minimal, precise concision of, something dealing with nature or philosophy, meditation. And yet there's quite a bit more going on that the translator and editor Adam L. Kern selected. And I think that bothered a number of readers, but I found it really interesting and illuminating. I learned a huge amount about 17th century Japan, the culture, 18th and 19th century as well. The major haiku poets, Bashō, but also Issa, Buson, Shiki, are all well represented, dozens from each of them in this volume. So it's certainly one I recommend. The other piece is that while the poetry itself throughout the volume is, in sort of a normal format, at the end, the second half of this book are all, they include notes where there's the English translation, the original Japanese with sort of a Romanized spelling, and then some notes around what was going on. And so this was, a volume to really savor and dig into. But I did want to give some examples of just how fun the haiku could be in here. So one of the most famous, from Bashō, one of the most famous poets, we have, "Upon withered bough, a crow has come to its rest, autumnal twilight." And there's even a calligraphy drawing of that verse here on the facing page. And so that's one of the most famous. "Upon withered bough, a crow has come to its rest, autumnal twilight." And above that one, we have another one from a poet, Kito, "Green seaweed in the recesses of a reef, forgotten tide." And so those seem like the types of haiku that we're used to, that we've heard, in schools or when we're, those of us who have just a very vague familiarity with haiku. But there are others that show sort of that whole challenge response sequence. So, "Ain't that the truth, ain't that the truth? Horse farts perturb 4 or 5 passengers aboard the ferry." Ain't that the truth? But also the way in which the poetry is this response. Another one, "Beyond a doubt, loan shark lying in wait outside the pawn shop." And so it can be a haiku response to this challenge. And on its own, it doesn't necessarily make sense. We wouldn't necessarily look at it and regard it as haiku, but Kern makes a really interesting and compelling argument about how this was another, sort of branch of the poetry. And so I enjoyed that aspect, certainly. But there were all sorts of works. "Viewing blossoms, how many of them I'd love, even as a wife." "What in the world? Someone blossom viewing, wearing a sword," which was kind of, strange. But the next one, then what we get is the editor compiles them in such a way that we get haiku around the same subject, sort of in a circle, and then one will branch off to another. So it ends up being this massive sequence of haiku to a certain degree. So "What in the world? Someone blossom viewing, wearing a sword." The very next one, a later, response to this. "What in the world? Someone tooth pulling, wearing a sword." So that was enjoyable. "No such thing in the shadows of blossoms as blushing strangers." Which I really enjoyed that. I read that one while my wife was on a travel assignment. I actually texted her that one. There were several I texted from this. I won't share all of them. Because one of the things I discovered was that some of these haiku were all about, romantic relationships or sexual relationships that weren't necessarily romantic. So we get works like, this is from Bashō, the famous, probably the most famous haiku poet from 17th century. "A clam from its shell, myself pried away from you, departing autumn." But there are certain associations that could be drawn from that. So I'll read it one more time. "A clam from its shell, myself pried away from you, departing autumn." And so we have the departing autumn, we have the season there, we have this sense of loss. But the next one, I think, points towards another association. And it also points to one of the great classical works of Japanese literature. "With Genji, pet names. Perfumed Duchess hardly stinks, for most bearded clams. Now, the bearded clams portion, in part, is in the Japanese language. It could have referred to fragrant prince, which was a term that was associated with the great tale of Genji from Lady Murasaki. But it could also refer to fragrant palace, which was a euphemism, and I'll leave you to figure out what that is. But again, I just really enjoyed this volume. It's one that I'm going to keep and reread and just spend time in. I don't know that I'll reread it every year, but it's one I'm going to return to on and off because there was just so much to appreciate. It was one where I was periodically marking with a pencil, and then at the end of a reading session, I would be copying out the ones that I felt really, just were speaking to me or were very interesting and enjoyable. So this was great. I just am so appreciative that it exists. In terms of haiku and Japanese literature, the Matsuo Bashō has other works, most famously Narrow Road to the Deep North, which was one of his travel sketches, and this volume compiles a number of those. This one was translated by Nobuyuki Yuasa. And so this is an interesting work. Provides a different perspective from the haiku as well. Sometimes there's poetry embedded within his reflections on his traveling. Another work that I was reminded of would be The Ink Dark Moon. These are love poems from the ancient courts of Japan, and these predate the haiku traditions by a few hundred years. The major love poets, Ono no Komachi and Izumi Shikubu, these are really fantastic. My wife actually is the one who found this, and we've both read it in full. I think we've both reread it in full. This is really interesting as well. Highly recommend it. The Tale of Genji, of course, was mentioned. In terms of Japanese culture that looks back on the haiku tradition in some ways. Some prefer Nettles by Junichiro Tanizaki is a work that's more focused on the puppet theater of Japan, but there's constantly this tension around modern Japanese culture and classical Japanese culture existing in this book, and it's a fascinating read if you've never explored it before. And then finally, I would like to mention Yasunari Kawabata, whose Snow Country is probably my favorite of his works. I've read a number of his books and enjoyed all of them. And he, from what I understand, his sentences to a certain degree approximate sort of that telescope that exists within the haiku, where you're compressing all of these ideas into such a small frame of reference, such a small text, and yet it acts almost as like the center of a spider's web with all the associations that can be drawn out from those words and references. And so despite the compression, it also telescopes out to have all sorts of different meanings. And so my understanding is that his prose imitates that in a number of ways, and I've just really enjoyed his novels. Moving out of Japanese poetry, my favorite work on Chinese poetry is Poems of the Late Taang, which is more the 8th, 9th century of Chinese culture. Highly represented there would be Tu Fu. So there's also a Li Po and Tu Fu volume. So those were just different works, and I really enjoyed the Penguin Book of Haiku. I'd be curious to know if anybody else has read it, if anybody else had a similar reaction in terms of enjoying just the many different routes and forms that the haiku took, or was surprised by that. So I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.